Can the US solve its debt ceiling crisis in time? With less than 2 weeks to a deadline to agree on how much the government can borrow, deep divisions remain. But what will happen if the two sides can't seal a deal, and what will be the global impact? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the program. I'm Nastasya Tay. Now, Republicans and Democrats are at loggerheads over the US debt ceiling, the amount of money that the country can borrow to keep going. It's also the funding that President Joe Biden needs to implement his policy program, something his Republican opponents are eager to block ahead of next year's presidential election. But failure to agree could have far-reaching consequences, not just for the US, but also for economies around the world. We'll be finding out why with our guests shortly and explore if an agreement is possible before the deadline. But first, this report from Alexandra Byers on how we got here.
The latest battleground between Republicans and Democrats in Washington has been the debt ceiling, or in other words, how much the U.S. government can borrow.
Have you spoke to the president?
No.
Since 2011, both sides have played what's become a near ritual game of high-stakes poker, waiting to see who blinks first before finally reaching an agreement. But this time around, there's deepening concern about the divide between the two sides.
The stakes could not be higher. A default would plunge our economy into recession. Economists estimate that millions of Americans could lose their jobs. Hardworking families could lose their retirement savings. So our team will stay at it. We will stay focused. And we hope that Speaker McCarthy's team will negotiate in good faith as well.
Everything's going well.
President Joe Biden accused the Republicans of holding the economy hostage. The top Republican negotiator says the White House is being unreasonable. The Treasury has warned that without a deal, the U.S. may be unable to pay its bills as soon as June 1st.
Are you confident you'll be able to reach that deadline?
No.
You're still not confident?
No.
So this candid discussion did not help increase that confidence at all?
No.
I do appreciate you all coming.
In exchange for raising the nation's borrowing limit, Republicans want to see deep spending cuts, including some of Biden's crucial domestic programs. These cover a wide range of plans, from unemployment welfare to climate change. The White House says failure to strike a deal will hit government services, affecting many people directly. But time is running out. If the U.S. defaults on its debt, government payments to millions of people who rely on them could suddenly stop. The White House estimates 500,000 people could lose their jobs in the short term. A longer default could cost more than 8 million jobs and slash economic growth by 6%. But it's not just people in the U.S. who should be worried. The shockwaves from a potential U.S. debt default could be felt globally, given the importance of the world's biggest economy. Alexandra Byers for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. In Washington, D.C., we have Laura Blessing. She's a senior fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University. And last year, she also testified to a congressional committee hearing on the debt ceiling issue. In Henderson, Nevada, William Lee. He's chief economist at the Milken Institute and also a former deputy division chief at the International Monetary Fund. And also in Washington, D.C., Simon Rabinovitch, the U.S. economics editor at The Economist. A very warm welcome to each of you, and thank you for joining us here today on Inside Story. I want to start with where we're at. So to be very clear, this is a political issue rather than an economic one, although it has huge economic repercussions. We were hearing a couple of days ago that everyone was saying that the talks were on track, then they were stopped abruptly, then they started again after a few hours, and throughout all of this, President Biden has been, well, he's at the G7, he's expected back on Sunday. Simon, is this all just tactics?
Well, it's certainly tactical at some level in the sense that the U.S. is at risk of running out of money to pay its debts by June 1st. That's the quote-unquote X date, after which the Treasury will have used up all of its money and all of its various different accounting gimmicks. And so the expectation for quite some time had been that negotiations would continue in fits and starts right up until the brink of that X date of June 1st. So the surprising thing last week was that it seemed that negotiations were tracking in a positive direction earlier than people had expected. It's not all that surprising that there was a breakdown on Friday, and I would anticipate that there will continue to be quite a lot of drama right up until the last moment.
So the Republicans ostensibly want to, I believe, freeze spending at last year's levels for a decade. But those cuts would be mostly on social programs and would obviously also halt Biden's climate agenda. I see, though, that the bill that they passed is diverse, to say the least, to seemingly get people on board. Laura, can I ask you, in your mind, how much unity is there on that side of the aisle?
That's a really good question, because these negotiations are troubled by a number of different factors, not just the fact that the two different parties are in control of the White House, the Senate, and the House, which makes negotiation more difficult, but also there are intra-party factions within the Republican Party, which is the main negotiating partner with that. The House Republican Party is the main negotiating partner with the White House right now. And so those divisions are really salient to how these negotiations are going to play out, how long they're going to last, and what a final deal might include. So you're asking absolutely the right questions. I think that we're definitely in a position where they're going to have to get Democratic votes just because the margins are so tight in the House. But we've seen we're having a little bit of a dance on this issue where both sides have started with opening bids, and now we're finally getting at the very last minute, getting down to brass tacks in terms of what an actual deal would have. You mentioned the Limit, Save, Grow Act, which would bring spending down to fiscal year 2022 levels and then cap growth in spending at 1% thereafter. These are extremely, extremely large cuts that are not politically realistic. And so we're now moving on to a stage where we're seeing what levels of cuts might be acceptable to the Democratic negotiating partners. And some of those are probably easier to do. Clawing back COVID funds, for example, is probably the sweetener that's going to allow Republicans to claim that they reduced spending while having Democrats be fine with that.
Sure.
But what's emerged as a real sticking point is the top line discretionary spending money for fiscal year 2024 federal appropriations, so the budget that they're working on right now.
I want to take a moment here because it feels like the House, correct me if I'm wrong, is trying to stop the administration from spending on policies that the House itself would need to pass. They approve what the government spends, right? William, is there a bit of a paradox here?
Well, no, actually, I think the Republican position has been very clear. They wanted to cap the degree to which the deficit has been rising over the last several years, in fact, several decades, because that is the main contributor to why the debt has become to more than 100% of GDP. So the Republicans want to really address the main source of the rise of debt, which is the entitlements. Now, discretionary spending is really already on its way down in the sense that defense spending and the discretionary part of the budget, people have made a lot of efforts to try to contain those, and the easy kills were going to be the COVID spending. But the main target for, I think, the Republicans will be the entitlements, and that's where we have a lot of pushback from all factions of the Democratic Party. And let's make it very clear that we have factions on both sides, the extreme left on the Democrats and the extreme right on the Republicans. And it's up to the White House and the congressional leaders to try to color these extremist sides to try to come to some sort of agreement now. But right now, I think that the main targets for the spending caps would be to try to address the entitlements, and the discretionary elements are just fillers to try to make the package work.
Sure. Still, though, up until, what was it, 2011, it felt like the debt ceiling was more of a formality, right? I was looking at the numbers. It has been raised on 78 separate occasions since 1960, 49 times under a Republican president, 29 times under a Democrat. But then it feels like it was weaponized when President Obama was then facing a Republican House back in 2011. And obviously at that time it went right down to the wire, and there were some very real consequences after that. But they did get the concessions, well, some concessions that they were asking for. So, Laura, let me ask you this. Did that set precedent, and could we see that happen again?
Everett, you're really right to point to 2011, because while I want to point out that the debt ceiling is something that has been politicized by both political parties going all the way back to 1953, there isn't really much of a good period for the debt ceiling. It certainly hasn't acted as a meaningful tool of fiscal restraint, but it became not just partisan, but also perilous in 2011. And I think we have there are some similarities to that time period. There are a few important differences as well. But you're right to be pointing out that there is real that you have Republican negotiators that are saying no to tax increases, same now as then, that are looking to substantially limit the government spending over time, and that are willing to go up to Treasury's X date to engage in negotiations. This is a dangerous game to be playing.
Well, I'm sure it's not gone unnoticed that it's also the lead up to an election year. I'm wondering how that's playing into things. So, Simon, is there a sense that President Biden is going to be the one who's going to cop the blame for whatever happens?
Well, certainly that's part of the Republican game plan, is the belief that if there is going to be a problem, whether for markets or for the economy more generally, that the blame will be on President Biden's shoulders. That will not play well in 2024, obviously, if there's a big recession in the lead up to the election. I do think it's worth taking a step back for a second, and I beg to differ actually with a couple of points that William raised earlier in this discussion. So it's clear that America's fiscal path is on a non-sustainable footing. If you look at deficit and debt projections from a neutral party like the Congressional Budget Office, it is quite worrisome. It is something that has to be addressed. The debt ceiling is not a very effective way of addressing it. If you look at the Republican demands, they're also not very effective either. William had suggested that they were focused in on entitlement programs. In fact, that's not true. If you look at the Limit Grow Save bill, it's almost entirely focused on discretionary spending. The Republicans themselves have accepted that big changes to things like Social Security and Medicare would be a third rail in American politics. They don't want to propose something that would be so dramatically unpopular with the public writ large. So they're focusing in purely on discretionary spending. So in other words, entitlements would stay more or less the same. The huge weight of cutbacks would affect things like education, transportation, salaries for federal employees, potentially deficit payments, debt payments as well. So that's the balance of the Republican focus. One of the frustrations on the Democrat side is that if you are seriously concerned about America's fiscal path, you can't just look at spending. You also have to look at revenues. One of the big reasons why America is in the fiscal mess that it currently is that whenever there's Republican administrations, they have pushed through quite aggressive tax cuts, most recently in 2017 under Donald Trump. These tax cuts have massively undercut the revenue generating side of the federal government here in America. And that's one of the big reasons for America's fiscal problems. So, really, if there is going to be a solution, you have to look at all three components. You have to look at spending on entitlement programs, spending on discretionary programs, and critically, you have to look at America's taxation powers. As far as the Democrats are concerned right now, the Republicans are only focused on one of those three elements. So there is a feeling like this is not a serious negotiation. This is a disingenuous negotiation. And to your point, it's highly politically motivated, knowing that the belief is that it'll wear very, very badly for the Democrats and for Biden in 2024.
And to be clear, both administrations, both Republican and Democrat administrations, have increased the debt. And I believe after the Republicans got the administration back in 2011 to agree on caps for government spending, they were then abandoned by the Republican-controlled Congress just a few years later, and they increased spending. But all of that aside, because that's going to be haggled over in the coming days, I want to talk a little bit about consequences, because this would be the first time in history that the US defaults on its debt, if it does indeed do that. And that's, for our global audience, not the same as a US government shutdown. It has far more serious, deep consequences that will go far beyond American shores. But let's start now at home. William, what happened back in 2011 that we were talking about resulted in a downgrade for the US credit rating. And that meant, I was looking at the numbers, the cost of borrowing went up for the US Treasury by at least $1.3 billion. If there's a deal that goes down to the wire this time round, could that happen again?
It is very likely that we will see that kind of result again because right now, as Simon said, because the main focus of negotiation has been on discretionary elements, and I mentioned the need to focus on the entitlements is really where the permanent solutions are going to be. S&P is going to come back to us and say whatever solution they come up with, if it's purely on discretionary spending, is disingenuous and won't be effective, and we will not put the debt path on a sustainable course. So I think one of the things that we will watch out for would be any kind of repeated downgrade. The AA rating that we have now may become single A, or our outlook will be downgraded. But also, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that this is an embarrassment that doesn't have to happen. Most countries set their debt limits not as a nominal number, but as a share of GDP. The Europeans, for example, in the EU, set their debt limits as a share of GDP at 60% of GDP. And so that would naturally raise the debt ceiling over time as inflation and pushes up various aggregates. Also, as far as international investors are concerned, this repeated kabuki dance has made the role of the U.S. dollar into a position where people question the value of holding U.S. treasuries as a source of sovereign wealth. And China, Japan have already reduced their holdings of U.S. treasuries by about 15% during the last year. And the likelihood is they will continue to reduce their holdings. So the consequences, both domestically and internationally, are really quite severe.
Just focusing a little more on the domestic consequences, I do want to talk more about potential international fallout in a minute. I was looking at projections from the White House in terms of scenario planning. They're saying 500,000 jobs could be lost for a short-lived default, a 0.6% decline in GDP, a longer one, 8.3 million jobs lost, 6.1% in GDP. Now, these are White House assessments. Laura, do you agree with those?
While I haven't done any sort of, I don't have alternate projections for you, I do think that it's important to note not just the multifaceted economic ill effects that such a default would cause, but even getting close to a default has very serious effects for us. Just like what we saw in 2011, we had a number of different economic ill effects, not just the downgrade, but cost to American taxpayers. GAO did a report of showing those costs, as well as just the stock market went down. Lenders were folks were not as excited to lend to the mortgage markets. Consumer confidence went down, and more. So even threatening a default and getting close to one can have serious economic effects. Certainly an actual default, completely unprecedented, would be truly catastrophic.
Because so much of this is about perceived risk, it feels like all that this political brinkmanship is going to do is cost Americans, right? Presumably make everything more expensive, not only for the Treasury, but for everyday Americans. And that would then, Simon, I'm going to throw this one at you, would that not just achieve the opposite of what the Republicans say they want?
Yes, certainly that's the case, that if the cost of borrowing for the federal government becomes more expensive as a result of this brinksmanship, that would obviously raise the cost of funding for the government. That would make the debt burden that much more difficult to manage. I think the key point, though, is that if America does actually get to the point that is defaulting on its debt, this would be something that was so unprecedented in the history of modern economics. America would be peering into the void. This would be an economic and a financial crisis. It could also very well be a constitutional crisis, because what happens the day after default, there will be a fundamental quandary for the Federal Reserve about how it should treat the American treasuries, the US government bonds that are in default. The basic playbook, which many believe that the Federal Reserve will follow because they began to map it out in 2011, is that they would continue to accept the defaulted securities as collateral, effectively taking them off the market. There would potentially be a constitutional challenge saying that this flies in the face of what Congress was doing when they were not raising the debt limit. So you would have incredible instability through financial markets, which would have clear knock-on consequences for America's short-term economic performance. There'd be fundamental questions about the long-term viability of American government paper. The position of the dollar would be questioned, as William has said. And then you'd have this political crisis, which would be ramped up from 0 to 60, overnight. So it's really taking America to a point that it cannot afford to go, and the rest of the world cannot afford to see America go in this direction. So, if you look at all of the different probability models for how the debt crisis is going to be resolved, the overwhelming assumption, 90% plus, is that they will raise the debt ceiling before the X date, before you have this kind of a problem. But the fact of the matter is, these kinds of repeat games of brinksmanship, eventually there is a risk of an accident. There is a risk of America going over the edge, even if it's just a short-term default, even if it's resolved after a couple of days. The consequences would be absolutely fearsome, domestically and internationally.
Well, let's peer a little more into that abyss, shall we? Because as you were saying, lots and lots of countries, as well as foreign central banks, do hold on to US Treasury bonds. Something like $500 billion of US debt is traded every day. Now, if the US defaults on its debt, we'd obviously be in uncharted territory, and obviously the US dollar, also the world's reserve currency. William, what happens for foreign central banks when something like this happens?
Well, the U.S. Treasury has a very special position. In fact, some of the audience members might think, well, why is it such a big deal if the U.S. Treasury defaults? After all, many governments around the world have defaulted on their debt. Many companies have declared Chapter 11. So what makes the U.S. Treasury so special? And I think the response to that is that every security in the world is priced off of U.S. Treasuries. The Treasury represents the very bottom layer of low risk and well understood pricing, so that when companies come to market, they price their debt as relative to where the Treasury yields are. If questions come into mind about the viability of U.S. Treasuries as a secure asset, as the safe credit-worthy asset, then every other company and every other country will be having difficulties pricing their securities and their assets. So that's why everyone talks about the U.S. Treasury as having a very special place in the world markets. And any kind of question of default would bring this disastrous consequences, because it would then freeze up the ability of companies around the world and countries around the world to issue bonds to finance their spending. And I think one of the consequences we've seen is that people are beginning to question more and more the viability of treasuries as a store of wealth. Countries no longer are thinking that holding their wealth in the form of U.S. treasuries is a safe way to preserve their sovereign wealth. And as I said earlier, Japan and China have already started reducing their holdings of treasuries by about 15–16% over the last year, 2022, from January to December. And that, I think, is the beginning of a trend which would bring into question the reserve currency role of the dollar and other features of the financial markets that have been the foundation of pricing and practice around the world.
Well, could we potentially, paradoxically, see the US dollar and US Treasury bonds strengthen? Because I wonder, in the past, when they've been considered very safe assets and investors like to invest in things when there's a huge amount of tumult in the world markets, I know there's been some speculation around that. But this also comes down to, again, perceived risk, right? So, Simon, do you think investors do believe that the US can pay its bondholders still, or has that trust been eroded?
I think that belief still exists. I mean, you can look at the pricing of US bonds both today, but also in the wake of 2011, the decade after America's last serious debt ceiling crisis. In fact, the attraction of US markets, of the dollar, only increased because, of course, the valuation of anything, any currency, any financial asset is always partly relative. And the basic fact of the matter is that there's no other currency on offer in the global arena that offers the same depth, the same liquidity, the same breadth of assets, the same legally sound footing that you will be able to get the full return that is owed to you. Your assets will not be expropriated. So America offers things which a country like China basically never can, given its current configuration. And I think you're right that there is the possibility that there might be some very perverse outcomes in the wake of a default. If the Fed does continue to accept defaulted securities as collateral, that would effectively keep the liquidity churning through the American financial system. Perversely, that would potentially make defaulted debt incredibly safe because the Fed is accepting it and the dollar is still seen as solid despite the default on the treasuries. I think the real problem in the short term is not going to be the dollar standing globally, but is going to be that you have a financial system that is predicated on treasuries being the ultimate risk-free asset. You've got pricing models that are based on treasuries being paid off on time and in full. As soon as you have the kinds of maneuvers that are going to be required to keep the show on the road, it's going to throw a wrench in the American banking system and the global financial system. It's really imponderable exactly what the consequences would be. You were asking Laura before about whether or not the forecast of 8 million out of work is a reasonable forecast. The basic answer is that nobody knows. This would be the most incredibly dangerous game for Congress to play with completely unpredictable outcomes. And so that's why we have to hope that cooler heads do prevail.
Well, let me ask you then, Laura, because we're talking about all this lack of predictability, this potential economic abyss for the globe. Is it just Kevin McCarthy now standing between us and potential global economic collapse? I mean, presumably he realizes that. And how do we stop this from then happening again?
That's a really good question. We absolutely have seen since 2011 the willingness of American politicians to run with scissors on this. And, you need to do something to take those scissors away or at least blunt them. I would love to see the debt ceiling just I'd love to do away with the thing entirely. It's entirely possible to do something where you can procedurally blunt it, where you allow Treasury to raise it and only a supermajority of Congress to undo that choice, to veto that choice essentially. But this is an incredibly, incredibly dangerous game that they're playing. I should also highlight that there are no negotiations. There isn't a part of the current negotiations that want to take this past the presidential election. So currently they're talking about maybe March. They're not talking about going past it. So, even if we manage to get past this one, they're looking to do a round two next year, which is extraordinarily irresponsible. And there are, as part of these negotiations, there don't appear to be serious consideration for how to, make this a more safe tool and to make it less dangerous. You absolutely do have different political actors that are prolonging this, that are making it worse, and it's entirely fair to identify that.
Well, there's so much at stake and, well, not just for the US, but also for the world. We'll continue watching it very closely here on Al Jazeera. But for now, we'll leave our discussion there. Thank you to all of our guests, William Lee, Laura Blessing and Simon Rabinovitch. And thank you, too, for watching. Remember, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.